I went through an Oklahoma rite of passage. I grew up in Oklahoma, and that rite of passage was to go to this church camp, really this just machine of a church camp called Falls Creek. I did that with every other student in a Baptist church growing up in Oklahoma. And 43 years ago, this summer, between my sophomore year in high school and my junior year in high school, I went to camp with my youth group. And when I went, I left home thinking I'm going to be in broadcasting for the rest of my life, which is what my father had done. But when I came home from camp at the end of that week, I realized that I had been called to be a full-time vocational minister. It just happened on a dime. And because it was, 43 years ago, we didn't have cell phones in our pockets. Do you all understand that? We didn't have cell phones in our pockets. And so I had to talk to my pastor who was with us, and we were always really close, our family's close. And so I told him what I was wrestling with, Pastor Ron Rice. And he affirmed me when I was talking to him and pointed out some things that he had seen in my life that made him believe that God was indeed calling me to ministry. But he said, Derrick, I'm not the Holy Spirit. And this is something that you are going to have to suss out with the Spirit and get that confirmation from him. And I said, how do I do that? And this is the information that he gave me. He said, Derrick, if you can think of anything else in the world that you would rather do and be happy and fulfilled, do it. And if you can't, then you're called to ministry. And I wasn't old enough to say at the time, what worthless information that you just gave me. I mean, I could have figured that out on my own. But it come to find out, that's the speech that all of us who are going into ministry get in some form or fashion, and that little bit of advice sealed it for me. And so for 43 years, I have never doubted that God has called me to vocational ministry. Most days I haven't doubted that. There have been times, even seasons in life where, to be honest, I wondered if God was clear in speaking to that 16-year-old boy, or if he was clear, and this is where we went a lot of times, if you were faithful to me in making that call in my life. Because there were times, quite frankly, I questioned God for calling me into ministry and for leading me to this life. The worst day of my ministry life, and it's not even close, happened years ago when multiple and independent long-term situations of trying to help folks, pastor folks, collapsed spectacularly, literally within hours of one another. I had 3 meetings back to back to back where I felt like a complete failure as a pastor, or was told that I was a complete failure as a pastor, which was crushing. And the day after those personal kind of nuclear explosions, I was alone in my car all day on a road trip. Now, I'm a radio guy. I like listening to music anytime I'm by myself. But I spent hours driving hundreds of miles in the car that day in complete silence. Silence that was only broken by fielding some residual phone calls stemming from the nightmare that I had endured the day before. And in that silence, I let God have it. I did. I told God I didn't deserve any of what had happened to me the day before. I told God that I felt like He owed me better. No, I had not been perfect in all my efforts, but I had been engaged. I wasn't checked out, and I'd been well-intentioned in everything that I tried to do. God, I have done everything I know to do to be faithful to what You called me to do, and I don't feel like You are being faithful to me. My faith in God for ministry, and in that moment, pretty much everything else was shaken. Now, obviously, most of you are not in ministry, but I'm guessing that my story activated the memory of a faith disruption that has occurred in your life. A moment serious enough that you questioned continuing in the faith, or like me, you questioned continuing a path of obedience to which you believed God had called you to. And those are scary moments, aren't they? Scary because we all know people whose faith never recovered from their valley of doubt. Scary because we're worried that the next time, and there most assuredly will be a next time for all of us, that our faith might not recover. So is there anything that we can do to strengthen our faith for those moments, or if we're going through them right now, strengthen our faith in those moments? Well, I think we discover that as we look to the book of Habakkuk. Would you find, please, trust me, it's in there. Would you find the book of Habakkuk? We are in a summer series of messages from the small group of books that is together at the end of the Old Testament called the Minor Prophets. And in that journey today, we come to the book of Habakkuk. And I never can be around this book without remembering one of my students in student ministry over 40 years ago. He came up to me. He was a 7th grade boy, always a 7th grade boy. He came up to me. He said, Derrick, I have found a book of the Bible I've never heard of before. And I said, well, what is it? And he said, Habakkuk. So that is in my brain right now. And if I say Habakkuk, I need you to shut up and just pretend I didn't, okay? I just need you to not know that I did it, okay? Habakkuk, what's that one about? Well, it's the one where a prophet's faith was shaken. Everything we know about Habakkuk, the man, we learn from Habakkuk, the Bible book. And even that information, frankly, is scant. From it, we know his name. We know that he was a prophet. And we know, and we'll see this, he prayed boldly. If we do detective work in the book, it allows us to determine that he ministered in the time period of Babylonian ascendancy, when they were rising as a world power, sometime around 612 BC, making him a contemporary of prophets that we know like Jeremiah. But nothing else is known of him biographically or otherwise. But he does tell us explicitly that he has a bone to pick with God and why his faith was shaken. Look at verse 2 of chapter 1. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? Why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth, for the wicked surround the righteousness, so justice goes forth perverted. Habakkuk here is complaining about the spiritual decay and the resulting injustice that he sees among his people, the people of Judah. And he's wondering, hey, I can see this, God. Why can't you see this? Why aren't you doing something about sin among your people that is so obvious? And so God answers. Look at verse 5. Look among the nations. This is God speaking. Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded. For I'm doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, that bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. What's God doing here? He's saying, I'm aware, I've seen it, and I'm raising up the Babylonians to be my instrument of judgment against Judah for the sins that you have noticed. I've seen them too, and this is what I'm doing about it. Look at Habakkuk's response, verse 12. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, a rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? Habakkuk is saying, this is a paraphrase, that's a terrible idea that you would use the Babylonians. Don't you know, God, that is a terrible idea? You're judging us by using people who are a million times more deserving of judgment than us. Are you kidding me? So, simply put, Habakkuk's first question is, God, are you paying attention to what's going on around Habakkuk? And then once he hears that God is, he questions if God has any idea at all what he's doing. The God who he had been taught was trustworthy suddenly seemed very much not to be to Habakkuk. And his journey through this season of doubt provides us with guidance for our own seasons of doubt and our misgivings about God and his ways. And the guidance that the book of Habakkuk gives us when our faith is shaken is faith. Faith, which seems counterintuitive. I mean, if faith is shaken, it seems futile to appeal to faith to shore it up. I mean, a lack of faith is the problem. But that is exactly what God instructs in the meat of the book, a part of the book that is quoted by authors in the New Testament 3 different times. Find verse 1 of Habakkuk 2 and we'll walk up to it. This is Habakkuk speaking. I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me, what God's going to say, and what I will answer concerning my complaint. We'll get a little deeper into the content of chapter 1 in just a minute, but here at the beginning of chapter 2, Habakkuk saying, I've said my piece, and now I'm waiting on God to answer me, which he does. Look at verse 2. And the Lord said to me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Fancy talk for saying, I've heard what you've said. I know you don't like my idea, but write it on a stone tablet, take it to the bank, book it. It's going to happen. And then this, verse 4. Speaking to Habakkuk. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him. He's speaking to Habakkuk, but then he gives the advice, counsel, instruction. But the righteousness shall live by his faith. The righteous shall live by his faith. That last bit is what is quoted in the New Testament books of Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. And here and in those books, the meaning is much, much more than what we typically make it. We tend to read faith as a passive thing, as a completely internal thing. In other words, we read verse 4 as telling us that we just have to click our heels 3 times and fold our hands and pray more. So then, the verse becomes something of a mantra to believers to just suck it up and hope harder. That's how we read it. Suck it up and hope harder. But the words righteousness, or righteous and live and faith are all connected to one another in verse 4, and they are active. To be righteous in the Old Testament was to live according to God's law and to express that in a love for neighbor. And faith would probably be best translated here as faithfulness. So what God is saying to Habakkuk is that those who continue to obey God, those who, when their faith is shaky, lean into their faith, are those whose faith will come out strong on the other side. Thus, Habakkuk isn't being told that those who question God just need to suck it up and hope harder. He's being told that those who continue to live faithfully in the midst of their questions and trials, that those who commit to being faithful to God, even when they don't understand Him, that those who actively trust Him, even when they have no idea what He's up to, they are the ones who will be delivered and have their shaky faith strengthened. So then, the guidance from the book of Habakkuk is guidance on how to activate that kind of tenacious faith when the faith that we're holding on to is just barely there. How to live by faith when faith is shaky. And to that end, there are 3 things that I want to point out to you in the book. First, I think Habakkuk guides us in this way, teaching us that we live by faith. We activate that shaky faith, strengthen it. When we live by faith, in God's presence. Now, as we've already pointed out, chapter 1 of the book that bears his name records Habakkuk giving 2 complaints to God. Complaint 1, verses 2 through 4. Lots of bad stuff happening among the people of Judah, God. Have you seen it? The rest of the chapter, God says, yep, I sure have. I sure have. Here's what I'm going to do about it. The rest then is Habakkuk saying, well, that's a terrible, terrible idea. You are wrong to use such a wicked people to be the judge of your people. And he just pours out, as chapter 1 concludes, his complaint. Here's the Bible word for it, his lament to God. I grew up in an era where boys were taught not to bellyache. I mean, I've said this before. I grew up in Oklahoma, did not grow up in a neighborhood. I mean, I grew up in a place that ended with the word holler. And so, you were outside and you were getting hurt and you would say, Dad, I'm hurt. And he said, I don't care. That's just the way it was. So if you're hurt, shake it off. And above all, don't cry. I was taught that in ministry, too. I was taught it informally. I mean, I cut my ministry teeth in a combative environment where leadership bravado was championed and softness was viewed as a fatal vocational weakness. That's the ministry world I lived in as a young man. And then I was taught it formally. I will never forget sitting in a doctoral seminar at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary as a megachurch pastor and former denominational president told a group of about 10 of us that the number one lesson, listen to me, the number one lesson he had learned in ministry was to never let them, he didn't tell us who they were, never let them see you sweat. Now, folks, when you are neck deep in that kind of emotional environment, it will taint your spiritual well-being. If showing weakness and vulnerability to ministry partners, or heaven forbid, the congregation that I'm called to shepherd, if that is to be avoided at all costs, then it is not hard for us to draw the conclusion that God doesn't want to hear it. That he doesn't want us belly aching either. But lament, like that being offered by Habakkuk, listen to me, is evidence of acting in faith and not contrary to it. In faith and not contrary to it. The laments are common in Scripture. We've got one whole section of the Psalms devoted to lament. We've got an entire book of the Bible, Lamentations, devoted to lament. The most common reason for lament in Scripture is injustice observed, frequently personally experienced. I don't have to try hard to find those kinds of things. Psalm 43:2, why do I go about mourning because of the oppression of my enemy? Psalm 56:1, be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me all day long. My attacker oppresses me. Psalm 69:4, more in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause. Lamentations 3:46 through 48. All our enemies open their mouths against us. Panic and pitfall have come upon us. Devastation and destruction. My eyes flow with rivers of tears because of the destruction of the daughter of my people. Now, that's rough stuff, and it's in the Bible. And with our eyes and our mouths full of complaints like those, like if we're saying, well, I'm going to do that, you could be forgiven if you have a hard time wondering how giving voice to those words is acting in faith and not contrary to it until you realize to whom those words are being spoken. God. That's why it's an act of faith. You are admitting in a lament that the only one who has real power to do anything about this is you. It's an act of faith. And that's the faith of lament. It is crying out in pain to the only one who can soothe it. So the lament itself is an act of faith because it's rooted in the conviction that God is listening and that God is present. A lament may be born in a season of feeling alone, but by voicing a lament, you are acknowledging that you aren't. You are living by faith in God's presence. Now, don't get me wrong. There is an entire segment of particularly on-vine evangelicalism that views doubt as a virtue, and doubt in Scripture is never viewed as a virtue. It's always something to be addressed and remedied. But in voicing doubt to God, you are acting in faith that He is present for your concerns. And it's then that you learn that living by faith not only requires you living in His presence, knowing that He's there to complain to if need be, but also that we live by faith in God's providence, His providence. I want you to notice what God says in response to Habakkuk's first complaint back in verse 6 of chapter 1. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. I'm the one doing that. History tells us something different. History tells us that the Babylonian Empire came to power when Nabopolassar, I tried real hard to get that one right, Nabopolassar had an attack against the city of Nineveh, and that city was defeated, and the Babylonians ascended to world power. But God is telling Habakkuk that He was the one behind the Babylonian rise to power. And history may tell us many, many things about why the Babylonian Empire existed, but God is saying it existed because I needed an instrument of judgment against my people. He's raising them for the express purpose of judging rebellious Judah. Now, Habakkuk doesn't like this. His cry for God to notice the spiritual bankruptcy of his people was meant to bring revival and not judgment, especially judgment at the hands of people so vile as the Babylonians. So he says, as we've seen already, verse 13, you who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent? So chapter 2 opens, as we've already seen, with Habakkuk just waiting on God to respond to him. And God responds again by undergirding everything that He has said it's absolutely going to happen. But then deeper into chapter 2, He says Babylon will not get a free pass. Just as God would judge the wickedness of Judah, God would judge the extreme wickedness of the Babylonians. So the bulk of chapter 2 is God showing Habakkuk just that. The Babylonians would have their day in God's court. But in the middle of these proclamations of judgment, God says this in verse 13 of chapter 2. Behold, it is not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing? It's just a poetic way of saying that the cycle of nations in world history, of nations conquering and building and empiring only to have it burned, only to have their work of nation building come to nothing, all of it is superintended by the Lord. This is a poetic way of saying that God is providentially reigning over the parade of nations throughout world history, meaning that in the very moment when Habakkuk's faith was shaken, God was reminding him, and us by extension as we read this book, that all of history is under His control. That means all of world history is underneath God's control, so that in the moment that you find yourself spiraling because you've mainlined 24-hour news, you're losing faith that God is in charge of it all. And just as He is in charge of world history, He's in charge of our personal history. The circumstances that come to our life are superintended by Him and under His control. So we need to live by faith in God's providence. He's reigning over world history, our circumstances. This can be especially comforting in seasons of trial. If we decouple from the truth that God is ruling over our trials and tribulations, life will feel random and God will seem capricious, and faith will be lost. But if in the midst of the most difficult seasons of life, we hold fast to the truth that God rules over all aspects of our life and creation, we can be sustained by the knowledge that God has a purpose in times of shaken faith, even when we have a hard time seeing it. And listen, I've been here a long time, and so I can look at each section in this service and in the previous service, and I can think of the stories of the people who attended services at the Ridgeview campus today, and I know some of the things that people have gone through, and I know some of the things that people are going through, and I know how hard it can be to hear that God is providentially reigning over it. It doesn't seem like a good God would even allow it to happen to me, and that's when faith gets shaken. But when we understand that every single thing is filtered through the hand of God, when we understand that God is causing all things to work together for the good of those who are called according to His purpose, those He loves, we can have the shaky, earthquake feeling faith experience start to steady. It can give us hope. I mean, let's just stop and think about the book of Lamentations, which I referenced earlier. Chapter 3 is the most famous chapter. Begins in verse 1 with Jeremiah, who wrote Lamentations, saying, "This stinks, and this stinks, and this stinks, and this stinks, and this stinks." And he goes on and on and on with it. And then he gets to verse 19, and he says, "Wait a minute. This I call to mind. Therefore I have hope. The mercies of the Lord never cease. They are new every morning. Great is the" what? Faithfulness of the Lord. Lament. Then he remembers God is providentially ruling over all of it. So live by faith in God's presence. He's there. He's listening. Talk to Him when your faith is shaky. Live by faith in His providence. Understand, as difficult as it is to grasp, God is superintending all of it. And then finally, live by faith in God's promises. The entire tone and tenor of the book changes in chapter 3. The book shifts from a record of Habakkuk's complaints and God's pronouncements of judgment to a record of prayer. I want you to look at chapter 3, verse 1. Begins a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, according to the Shigionoth. He says, "O Lord, I've heard the report of you." Think of everything that he's heard about judgment and the complaints that he had. But now he's saying, "Lord, I've heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of your years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy." What is he saying? He's about to lead us through remembering where it all started, with a captive, enslaved people delivered by the powerful hand of God from slavery in Egypt to become a people His very own. He's remembering essentially what for him would be processed as a salvation experience. He's remembering that the Lord saved him, and he's remembering the promises that God gave His people, leading him to make probably the most famous statement in the book, one that a lot of people have heard, maybe not known where it's come from. He says, "Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation." What he's saying here is that I don't need the fig tree to blossom. I don't need there to be fruit on the vines. I do not need the olive to make its produce, and I do not need the fields to yield food. I do not need the flock to be in the fold, because I'm yours. And in you, I have all I need. And so he says, God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. And then he lets us know that this became a part of corporate worship to the choir master with stringed instruments. Simply put, he's saying, if everything continues to unravel around me, I will find my joy, I will find my peace in the God of my salvation, knowing that the final and full deliverance and the promise that he made to me is on the way. It's remembering that God has done something for me in the past that's radically changed me, that carries with it a promise that can never be taken away. So with his faith shaken by the Lord's seeming inaction and ways that frankly at times are hard to get, Habakkuk is reminded that the righteous live by faith. Faith in God's presence in the midst of their circumstances, faith in God's providence over our circumstances, faith in God's promises to us, holding fast to them in the midst of our circumstances. So our faith in trying times is not sustained. It is not the scriptural counsel for us to suck it up and hope harder. It is sustained by leaning into a shaky wall of faith, so that in exercising faith in a time where everything in us screams to be faithless, we find our faith strengthened on the back end. So how do we do that? What are some things that we can do in the midst of it? Let me give you 3 very quick, hopefully memorable things. If you find yourself in a time of shaky faith, or if you're wondering how to prepare yourself when those moments come. First, when faith is shaky, pray more, not less. We tend to go just the opposite direction. I don't want to talk to God. In times of shaky faith, pray more, not less. Offer lament. Cry out to him. It will remind you that he's there, that he is present in the midst of your trying times. Second, when faith is shaky, worship more and not less. I've seen it happen a million times. You can almost put it in the bank. Somebody will go through a crisis vocationally, or a crisis in their family, crisis with their marriage, and all of a sudden they start backing off. They quit coming to join God's people in corporate worship. You can set the clock, they'll be gone. They'll be gone. Because they are not constantly with God's people reminding themselves that he's on the throne, that he's ruling and that he's reigning over life. So pray more, not less, if your faith is shaky. Remind yourself he's there. Worship more, not less, when faith is shaky. Remind yourself of who he is. And then finally, when faith is shaky, reflect more and not less. This is what Habakkuk does. He looks at everything that's going on around him in chapter 1 and chapter 2, and he thought, well, let's just remember what's true. I'm a child of God. And mercy is his default to me, and I will experience that one day. Reflect more on your salvation, not less, when your faith is shaky. Because active faith is the antidote to failing faith. So if you're in a season of struggle right now, sink your roots more deeply into God, even if you currently find him hard to understand, in order to find out on the other side of this season that your faith in him is stronger than it's ever been. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.